So what ends up happening is the artist projects out this subjective interpretation into the world, and that interpretation, according to Nietzsche, is denied by the establishment. He says, quote, that have been denied outward release by the establishment. By turning inward in concert with the imagination, the artist then turns inward, right? The artist then becomes introspective, right? The artist then turns inward, and that inward interpretation, I put my information out for consumption, for review, for presentation. It is denied by the establishment. That denial by the establishment forces the artist to turn inward to his or her own work, to his or her own sense of interpretive faculties, to reassess so that we can represent the work, right? I find this personally, despite the fact that I wouldn't consider what I do art, I find this personally to be true from my own experience, right? My subjective interpretations of Nietzsche are not canonical interpretations of Nietzsche. My lecture series is in no way sort of a reiteration of existing interpretations of Nietzsche. This is a wholly new interpretation of Nietzsche. Some of it is standard, but most of my interpretation is influenced by race, urban development, my body, my masculinity. A lot of it is, I funnel my interpretation of Nietzsche through the physical. I present that information into the world, and that information is absorbed by some, but it is denied. Right there, with 18 videos in, I got the sense that the external community was already denying the interpretive aspects of my presentation. I go back to the drawing board and I reassess it and try to represent the information again. And this is a continually ongoing process, right? The artist is always continually in the process of re-envisioning his or her artistic modality, the way in which the art is presented to the consumer to the overall consumers, right? An artist who presents information and continually presents it in exactly the same manner, right? We want to challenge the nature of the art, right? And challenge the nature of that which the artist does. So underneath the image, on page 68, the establishment reinforces, right? The establishment reinforces the denial of the artist, since the artist challenges the establishment, right? Through introspection rather than assimilation. So I want to explain that bit a little bit to make sense of it, right? So the idea is the establishment reinforces the denial. So here's the establishment, here's the artist. The artist projects, the establishment denies, right? So the establishment reinforces the denial of the artist, since the artist challenges the establishment. This, whatever this is that the artist creates, right, is a challenge to the establishment. And the question becomes how and why. How is it a challenge? Why is it a challenge? I don't want to go too far off, because this isn't a discourse on aesthetics. I might do that lecture series in the future. But the question becomes, how is it a challenge? The product, the artistic work, a challenge to the establishment. This is very important. I've done a video series earlier about the distinction between high context and low context, and I'm not going to get into that now. Low context cultures, for example, the United States and other individualistic cultures, means that basically what we say is what we mean, right? The context with which we are speaking is relatively low with respect to sort of contextual placement. I just say it, and basically that's what I mean. High context culture, a lot of body language, a lot of innuendo, a lot of suggestion, a lot of context is needed in order, a high amount of context is needed to make sense of what is being said. In individualistic societies rather than collectivistic societies, the context is very low. We don't need to have a lot of context in order to make sense of what's being said. Art is primarily a high context. So, right, art is high context. The whole point of art is to be high context. Now, granted, I have seen paintings where, I forget who did the piece, but the piece will be the words, this is a painting painted on a canvas, in words, in English, right? This is a painting. And it challenges the sense of art being high context because it's very low. It's telling you that this is a painting. Without discussing the, sort of very abstracted, and those of you who really understand, that's a very powerful thing to say, and I can't get into unraveling why that's significant and why that challenges the discourse on art, because it's not a discourse on art properly. But in general, art is very high context. What does that mean in sort of easy, sort of ghetto philosophy? It means that there's many different ways of interpreting the piece, right? It's all contextual. The interpretation of the piece is itself contextual. What the artist does, what a good artist does, is recognizes that the more contextualized his or her piece is, the more general, in a sense, the more vague, the more ambiguous the piece is, the many different ways in which the piece will invariably be interpreted, right? What ends up happening is the artist really doesn't have control then on, and this is more Gadamer, but the artist really doesn't then have control over the ultimate interpretation that the piece will have. Just because I intended the piece to be a piece about a dove, flying over a bridge, something just popped right off the top of my head, and I put that piece out into the world. Those within the artistic world, those within the artistic community, consumers at large, who consume my art, might look at that piece and think, wow, this really is a challenge to hegemonize power. Now, I didn't mean it to be that. What ends up happening is the establishment doesn't like the fact, right, the status quo, those in power, don't like the fact that artists can then galvanize a population. You can mobilize a population via art, right? I mean, this is obvious. Really good art mobilizes the population. It's a very, very powerful tool, right? The idea then is that art as such becomes a challenge to hegemonized power, right? So that the artist, when the artist is doing his or her work well, presents to the population of consumers, to the artistic community, his or her subjective interpretations of the world artistically. That artistic representation actually transcends the interpretation of the artist itself, him or herself, and it stands to challenge hegemonized power. Those in the establishment want to deny the interpretive abilities of the artist by saying, oh, it's not good enough, you're not scholarly enough, you weren't well trained enough, you don't understand the canon, blah, 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 what have you, to try and discredit and dissuade the artist from continuing his or her endeavor. And the idea is, this is the relationship, right? This is the relationship between the establishment and the artist. If the artist is really good, what will happen is the power will try to incorporate the artist into the structure of hegemonized power. And then the artist just becomes, part of the propaganda machine. If they switch to the dark side, if you will. So here's a quote from Nietzsche. Again, when one has extreme clear-sightedness, right, this is important, when one has extreme clear-sightedness, one needs the genius of the actor. Remember, I'm using the actor and the artist sort of interchangeably. When one has extreme clear-sightedness, one needs the genius of the actor, a tremendous training in self-control, if one is to achieve victory. If you want to win, you need the genius, Nietzsche says, right? And that's a pretty heavy term for Nietzsche to say that the actor, the artist, is a genius. We see that the actor, the artist, has, and I'll talk about this in a second, right? The actor, the artist, has two faces, right? Pip did a very, very, very good video contribution much, much earlier in the lecture series where he talked about the mask, right? The mask that I put on as Jason J. Campbell conceals the truth behind this mask. All of this is a facade. All of it, right? It's been a facade since day one. I've been honest with that, right? This is just a part of who I am. The artist presents himself for consumption, presents his art for consumption. But behind that, behind the facade, behind the veneer is the truth. The idea is the consumer is always interested in getting past the facade to get to the truth, that which informs the art, and the artist is trying to keep you engaged with the work. The two aspects that Nietzsche discussed, one is the actor, or the artist, right?